The morning stars of Kepler 442b cast their pale light across the crystalline spires of our capital city when humans first arrived. I remember standing on the observation deck of the High Council Tower, my four arms folded behind my back as I watched their crude metal ships descend through our atmosphere like falling stones. The other members of the Zephyrian Council whispered among themselves, their translucent skin flickering with a nervous bioluminescence that betrayed their anxiety. "They look so primitive," muttered Counselor Vex, his serpentine form coiled around his floating meditation sphere. "Their technology appears to be barely beyond chemical propulsion. How did such a backward species even achieve interstellar travel?" I shared his confusion. For 3,000 years, the Zephyrian Empire had dominated this sector of the galaxy. Our biotechnology was unmatched, our psychic abilities legendary, and our military might had crushed 17 different civilizations that dared to challenge our supremacy. These humans, with their metal boxes and their apparent lack of any psychic presence, seemed like nothing more than an interesting curiosity. High Counselor Thane, ancient beyond measure and wise beyond our understanding, raised one of his 6 arms for silence. "Do not underestimate any species based on first appearances," he said, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. "I have lived long enough to see empires rise and fall. There is always more beneath the surface." But even Thane seemed unconcerned as we watched the human ships land in the designated area outside our city. They had sent a diplomatic message ahead of their arrival, requesting an audience with our leadership. The message was simple, almost crude in its directness. They claimed to represent something called the United Earth Federation and wished to establish peaceful relations with our empire. The irony was not lost on any of us. A species that had barely crawled out of its home system wanted to establish relations with us, as if they were equals. It was almost charming in its naivety. The first human I ever saw in person was Ambassador Sarah Chun. She walked into our grand council chamber wearing a simple black uniform, her small bipedal form dwarfed by the magnificent architecture that surrounded her. Her hair was dark, her skin was a warm brown color, and her eyes were a shade of brown that seemed to hold depths I hadn't expected. What struck me most was her complete lack of fear. Here she stood, surrounded by beings that could crush her with a thought, in a chamber that had seen the surrender of dozens of alien species, and she showed no sign of intimidation whatsoever. If anything, she seemed almost bored. "Honorable Council," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I bring greetings from the United Earth Federation and from all of humanity. We come in peace, seeking friendship and mutual understanding." Counselor Vex couldn't help but laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "Friendship? Little creature, you speak as if you have something to offer us. Your ships are made of metal and combustion engines. Your people have no psychic abilities that we could detect. You cannot even properly terraform a planet. What could you possibly offer the Zephyrian Empire?" Ambassador Chen smiled, and there was something in that expression that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't understand why at the time. "We offer what all humans have always offered," she said. "We offer ourselves, our knowledge, our perspectives, our unique approaches to problems. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." High Counselor Thane leaned forward, his ancient eyes studying the human with interest. "You speak of unique approaches. Give us an example." "Well," Chun said, clasping her hands behind her back, "we understand that you've been having some trouble with the Scaraxian raiders in the Outer Rim. They've been hitting your supply convoys and then disappearing into the asteroid fields before your fleets can respond." The chamber fell silent. The Scaraxian problem was supposed to be classified information. How could these humans possibly know about it? "Your intelligence networks are better than we assumed," Thane said carefully. "We observe. We listen. We learn," Chin replied. "It's what humans do. As for the Scaraxians, you've been trying to hunt them down with your psychic tracking abilities, but they've learned to shield themselves. You've been sending large fleets that are too slow to catch them once they retreat. You've been approaching this as a traditional military problem. And what would you suggest? Counselor Vex asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Bait, Chin said simply. Make them come to you. Send out a convoy that looks valuable, but is actually a trap. When they attack, you don't try to chase them. You follow them home. You find their base. Then, you eliminate the entire organization in one decisive strike. The simplicity of it was stunning. We had been overthinking the problem, using our advanced technology and psychic abilities to try to out-clever the raiders. The human solution was direct, brutal, and undeniably effective. That is, not without merit, Thane admitted. But surely your people want something in return for sharing such insights. Trade agreements, Chen said. Safe passage through your territory. Perhaps some cultural exchanges. We're not asking for much. It seemed reasonable. Almost too reasonable. Over the following days, I found myself assigned to work with the human delegation, and I began to learn more about their species than I had ever expected. They were adaptable in ways that defied logic. While we Zephyrians required specific atmospheric conditions and carefully controlled environments, the humans seemed able to function almost anywhere. I watched Ambassador Chun work for hours without rest, eating whatever food was provided without complaint, sleeping in quarters that would have driven most species to madness with their stark simplicity. Their technology, while primitive by our standards, was robust and reliable. Where our bioorganic systems were elegant and powerful but required constant maintenance and specific conditions, the human machines seemed able to function under almost any circumstances. They called it over-engineering and seemed almost proud of how crude and tough their equipment was. But it was their minds that truly fascinated me. Humans, I learned, were incapable of any form of psychic communication. They had to rely entirely on spoken language, written words, and physical gestures to share information. This should have been a crippling disadvantage, but somehow they had turned it into a strength. Because they couldn't share thoughts directly, every human had developed their own unique perspective on reality. Where we Zephyrians thought alike because our minds were naturally linked, humans were forced to think as individuals. This meant that when they came together to solve a problem, they brought dozens of different approaches and ideas. I spent hours talking with Chun about human history, and the stories she told me were both inspiring and terrifying. Humans, it seemed, were a species that had specialized in overcoming impossible odds. She told me about something called the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 human warriors had held off an army of thousands. She described the siege of Stalingrad, where humans had fought for months in the ruins of their own city rather than surrender. She spoke of explorers who had crossed frozen continents, climbers who had conquered impossible mountains, and inventors who had turned dreams into reality through sheer determination. Humans don't give up, she explained to me one evening as we stood on my private balcony, looking out over the city. It's our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. We'll keep fighting long after any rational being would surrender. We'll keep trying long after any sensible person would admit defeat. That sounds exhausting, I said. She laughed, a sound I had come to enjoy. It is. But it's also why we're here, talking to you among the stars, instead of still hunting animals with pointed sticks on our home planet. The trade agreements were signed after 2 weeks of negotiations. The Scaraxian problem was solved exactly as Chun had suggested, with devastating effectiveness. The humans established a small embassy in our capital and began regular trade runs between Earth and our territory. For several months, everything seemed perfect. The humans were model citizens of our sector, causing no trouble and bringing interesting new ideas and technologies to our markets. They were fascinating to watch and surprisingly pleasant to work with. I should have remembered High Counselor Thane's warning about not underestimating species based on first appearances. The first sign that something was wrong came when our psychic monitoring stations in the Outer Rim went silent. These stations were hidden in deep space, cloaked and shielded, designed to be undetectable to any known technology. They served as our early warning system against invasion or other threats. When the first station went dark, we assumed it was a technical malfunction. When the second disappeared, we began to worry. By the time the fifth station had been destroyed, we knew we were under attack. The problem was, we had no idea who was attacking us. Our remaining sensors showed no signs of large fleets moving in our territory. There were no energy signatures from weapons fire, no debris fields from destroyed stations. The monitoring posts were simply there one day and gone the next. High Counselor Thane called an emergency session of the Council. The Grand Chamber was filled with nervous energy as the most powerful beings in our empire gathered to discuss the threat. Could it be the Scaraxians? Asked Counselor Rax, her crystalline form shimmering with anxiety. Perhaps they developed new technology? Impossible, replied Military Commander Zeth, his scarred hide telling the story of 100 battles. We destroyed their entire organization. There are no Scaraxians left in this sector. Then who? Demanded Counselor Vex. What enemy are we facing? That's when Ambassador Chen spoke up. I had almost forgotten she was there, sitting quietly in the observer section. If I may, she said, her voice cutting through our arguments like a blade through silk. The chamber turned to look at her, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something different about her expression, something cold and calculating that hadn't been there before. Ambassador, Thane said carefully, you have insights into our situation? I might, she replied, standing and walking toward the center of the chamber with that same casual confidence she had always displayed. But first, I have a confession to make. I haven't been entirely honest with you about why humans came to your territory. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even our breathing seemed to have stopped. You see, Chun continued, humans didn't just stumble across your empire by accident. We've been watching you for almost 50 years. We know about every world you've conquered, every species you've enslaved, every atrocity you've committed in the name of expanding your power. What are you saying? Counselor Vex hissed, his form beginning to coil in preparation for attack. Chun smiled, and this time there was nothing pleasant about the expression. I'm saying that the United Earth Federation didn't send me here to establish friendly relations. We sent me here to gather intelligence, to learn about your capabilities, your weaknesses, your command structure. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation I'd had with her, every piece of information I'd shared, every detail about our technology and our defenses that I casually mentioned in our friendly talks. You've been spying on us, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Of course, she replied. It's what humans do. We observe, we listen, we learn, and then we act. High Counselor Thane rose from his throne, his ancient frame radiating power. You dare to threaten us? A single primitive species against the might of the Zephyrian Empire? We have crushed civilizations that were 1,000 times more advanced than yours. Yes, Chen said, you have. That's exactly why we're here. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. It looked harmless enough, just a simple rectangular object made of that crude human metal technology. But when she pressed a button on its surface, the chamber filled with a sound I had never heard before. It was the sound of hyperspace engines. Thousands of them. Through the great windows of the council chamber, we watched as the sky above our capital city filled with ships. Human ships, but not the crude metal vessels that had arrived months ago. These were sleek, deadly, and numerous beyond counting. They dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, surrounding our planet like a steel net. Ow! Thane demanded. Your technology is primitive. Your ships are slow. How did you really think, Chen interrupted, that a species capable of traveling between stars would send their most advanced technology on a first contact mission? Did you really believe that we would show you our true capabilities when we were trying to gather intelligence on a potential enemy? The truth hit me like a falling mountain. Everything we had seen, every assumption we had made about human technology and capabilities had been carefully crafted deception. They had shown us exactly what they wanted us to see. The ships that arrived months ago, I said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place, they weren't your best. They were designed to look primitive. Exactly, Chen confirmed. We needed you to underestimate us. We needed you to think we were harmless and backward so you would let your guard down. And it worked perfectly. Counselor Vex's form was coiling tighter, preparing to strike. You may have more ships than we expected, but you still lack psychic abilities. Our mind powers will crush your fleets like. His words were cut off as every Zephyrian in the chamber suddenly screamed in agony. A wave of psychic energy had washed over us, but it wasn't an attack. It was something far worse. It was silence. Our psychic abilities, the telepathic connections that linked us to each other and to our technology, were simply gone. Cut off, blocked by some kind of interference that felt like having our souls ripped from our bodies. Psychic dampening fields, Chen explained casually, as if she were discussing the weather. We developed them specifically for this encounter. Amazing what you can accomplish when you set your mind to it. High Counselor Thane was staggering, his ancient form suddenly, looking frail and vulnerable without the psychic energy that had sustained him for millennia. This is impossible. No species has ever been able to block psychic abilities. No psychic species has ever been able to block psychic abilities, Chen corrected. But we're not psychic. We approach problems differently. We found a way to generate a field that interferes with the quantum resonance patterns that your telepathy relies on. Simple physics, really. The chamber was filled with the sound of our people crying out in fear and confusion. Without our psychic abilities, we were lost, confused, barely able to function. Our technology, our weapons, our communications, all of it relied on psychic interfaces that were now useless. What do you want? Thane asked, his voice broken and weak. Ambassador, Chen looked around the chamber, taking in the sight of the mighty Zephyrian Council reduced to helpless confusion. When she spoke, her voice was cold as the void between stars. Justice, she said, for 17 civilizations, for billions of innocent beings, for every world you've conquered and every species you've enslaved. Through the windows, I could see more human ships arriving, massive vessels that dwarfed even our largest dreadnoughts. The invasion fleet that humanity had apparently been building for decades, preparing for this moment. You studied us, Chen continued. You learned about our primitive technology and our lack of psychic abilities. But you never bothered to study our history. You never learned about what humans do to bullies and tyrants and empires that think they can take whatever they want through force. She walked closer to High Counselor Thane, looking up at his towering form without a trace of fear. We end them, she said simply. Every single time, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs us, we end them. The last thing I saw before the human soldiers entered the chamber was Ambassador Chen's smile. It was the same pleasant expression she had worn during all of our friendly conversations, but now I finally understood what I had been seeing in it from the very beginning. It wasn't friendliness at all. It was the patient, satisfied expression of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The human soldiers who entered our council chamber moved with a precision that made my blood freeze. They wore armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected our terrified expressions back at us. Each one carried weapons that hummed with energy I couldn't identify, technology that was clearly far beyond anything we had seen from them before. But what terrified me most was how quietly they moved. These weren't the clumsy, noisy primitives we had imagined humans to be. They flowed through the chamber like shadows, taking positions with the practiced ease of born warriors. In less than 30 seconds, every exit was blocked, every Zephyrian council member was covered by at least 2 weapons, and the most powerful room in our empire had become a prison. Please remain calm, Ambassador Chen said, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a request. No one needs to be harmed if you cooperate fully. High Counselor Thane, still struggling with the loss of his psychic abilities, managed to straighten his ancient frame. You cannot hope to hold an entire empire with a single fleet, he said. Our military will respond. Our allies will come to our aid. Chen's smile never wavered. Your military is already responding, she said. Let me show you. She gestured to one of the soldiers, who stepped forward and activated a holographic display in the center of the chamber. The image that appeared made my heart stop beating. It was a tactical map of our entire empire, showing the positions of our fleets, our defensive installations, and our major worlds. But scattered throughout the display were red markers indicating human forces, and there were far more of them than should have been possible. As we speak, Chin explained, human fleets are engaging your forces at 17 different systems. Your psychic communication networks have been jammed, so your commanders can't coordinate their responses. Your bioorganic ships are failing because we've introduced a virus that attacks their living components. Your static defenses are being overwhelmed by weapons specifically designed to counter your technology. Counselor Vex, his serpentine form trembling with rage and fear, managed to speak. "How long have you been planning this?" 73 years, Chin replied matter-of-factly. "Ever since we made first contact with the Keeleran refugees." The name hit me like a physical blow. The Keelerans had been one of the first species we had conquered when I was young, barely old enough to serve on the council. They had been a peaceful people, known for their art and philosophy. We had enslaved them for their ability to grow the exotic crystals our technology required. "You remember them," Chin observed, watching my expression. "Good. They were the first survivors to reach human space about 75 years ago. Just a few thousand refugees in damaged ships, fleeing the destruction of their homeworld." She walked slowly around the chamber as she spoke, her hands clasped behind her back like a teacher giving a lecture. "Humans have a saying, 'The enemy of my enemy is my friend.' When the Keelerans told us about the Zephyrian Empire, about what you had done to their people, and to others, we knew we had found our enemy. You spent 70 years preparing for a war against a species you had never met." I asked, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. "We spent 70 years preparing to stop you," Chen corrected. "There's a difference. Humans don't start wars for conquest or glory. We fight wars to end things, to stop bullies, to protect the innocent." The holographic display shifted, showing detailed intelligence reports on our military capabilities, our economic systems, our political structure. The depth of information was staggering. Every weakness, every vulnerability, every secret we thought we had kept hidden. The Keelerans weren't the only survivors to reach human space, Chen continued. Over the decades, refugees from 16 different species made contact with us. Each one brought more information about your empire. Each one begged us to help their people still trapped under your rule. Military Commander Zeth, his scarred hide pale with shock, stepped forward. Our security was perfect. Our counterintelligence networks were impenetrable. "How did you infiltrate our systems?" "We didn't," Chen said. "We didn't need to. You did all the work for us." She gestured to another soldier, who activated a different display. This one showed a timeline spanning decades, marking every interaction between humans and Zephyrians. Trade missions, Chen explained. Cultural exchanges, diplomatic visits, scientific conferences. For 70 years, we've been sending people into your territory under perfectly legitimate pretexts. Each one gathered a little more information. Each one learned a little more about your capabilities. The scope of it was breathtaking. Humans have been playing a game that spanned generations, slowly building a complete picture of our empire, while we remained completely unaware of their true intentions. The Scaraxian problem was a test. I realized suddenly. You already knew the solution because you had studied their tactics. Of course, Chen confirmed. We needed to demonstrate our value as allies while also testing your decision-making processes. The fact that you accepted our strategy so readily told us a great deal about how your military thinks. High Counselor Thane was staring at the tactical display, watching as red markers continued to spread across our territory. "You're not just attacking us," he said slowly. "You're liberating our colonies." "Every single world," Chen confirmed. "Every species you've enslaved will be free by the end of this operation." The Keelerans are already back on their homeworld, rebuilding their civilization. The Thoraxians have reclaimed their moon colonies. The Vex TI are once again masters of their own destiny. The chamber filled with the sound of incoming communications as our remaining systems try to process the flood of reports from across the Empire. Each message brought news of another defeat, another world lost, another fleet destroyed. "This is impossible," Counselor Rax whispered, her crystalline form flickering with distress. "No one species could coordinate an operation of this scope." "You're right," Chin said. "One species couldn't. But this isn't just a human operation." The tactical display changed again, showing the composition of the attacking fleets. Mixed in with the human ships were vessels I recognized from a dozen different species. Ships that should have been destroyed decades ago when we conquered their worlds. "The refugees didn't just bring us information," Chin explained. "They brought us allies. Every species you've wronged has contributed to this operation. Ships, weapons, soldiers, intelligence. You created your own enemies and then drove them straight into our arms." I watched in horror as the display showed the true scope of the coalition arrayed against us. Humans had indeed spent 70 years preparing for this day, but they hadn't done it alone. They had built an alliance of every species that had ever suffered under Zephyrian rule. "The biovirus attacking our ships," Military Commander Zeth said, his voice hollow with realization. "It was designed by the Forlax scientists we enslaved, wasn't it?" "Among others," Chin confirmed. "The psychic dampening technology came from Mindari. The stealth systems on our ships were developed by the Shadowkin. The energy weapons were perfected by the Thoraxians. Every species contributed their expertise to ensure this operation's success." The irony was crushing. Our empire had been destroyed by the very people we had conquered, using knowledge and technology we had forced them to develop for us. "You turned our victims into weapons against us," I said. "We gave them the chance to fight back," Chin corrected. "Humans believe that every intelligent being has the right to be free. When we found species that had been enslaved and oppressed, we offered them the opportunity to reclaim their freedom. They did the rest themselves." A new sound filled the chamber as explosions echoed from somewhere in the city. Through the great windows, I could see human dropships landing in the streets below, disgorging soldiers who moved with that same terrible precision I had witnessed in the council chamber. "Your capital is surrounded," Chun announced. "Your government is under our control. Your military is being systematically dismantled across the empire. This phase of the operation will be complete within 6 hours." "And then what?" High Counselor Thane asked. "Will you enslave us as we enslaved others? Will you build your own empire on the ruins of ours?" Chin's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion I had seen from her since the revelation began. "No," she said. "That's not what humans do." She walked to the great windows and looked out over our capital city. "Humans don't conquer. We liberate. When this is over, every species in your former empire will be given the chance to govern themselves. Your own people will have the same opportunity once you've learned to coexist peacefully with your neighbors." "You would trust us to govern ourselves after what we've done?" I asked. "Not immediately," Chin admitted. "There will be a transition period. Human administrators will oversee the process of establishing democratic governments on your worlds. War crimes tribunals will be established to ensure justice for the worst offenders. Reparations will be paid to the species you've wronged." She turned back to face us, her expression serious but not unkind. "But eventually, yes. We'll trust you to govern yourselves. That's what freedom means. The right to make your own choices, even if those choices are sometimes wrong." Counselor Vex's form had uncurled slightly, confusion replacing some of his anger. "Why? After everything we've done, why would you give us that chance?" "Because," Chin said simply, "that's what humans believe in. We believe that any intelligent species can learn to be better than they were. We believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that even former enemies can become friends." The explosions outside were getting closer, but somehow they seemed less threatening now. These weren't the sounds of wanton destruction. They were precise, controlled demolitions targeting specific military installations. "The Keeleran refugees," I said suddenly, understanding dawning. When they reached human space, you could have simply given them sanctuary. You could have ignored their stories about our empire. Why didn't you? Chin's smile returned, but this time it was sad rather than predatory. Because that's not who humans are, she said. We can't ignore injustice. We can't stand by while innocents suffer. It's a flaw in our character, I suppose. We can't mind our own business when there are bullies in the galaxy. Even when minding your own business would be safer, I observed. Especially then, Chun confirmed. Humans have never been good at choosing the safe path. We tend to choose the right path instead. High Counselor Thane was studying the tactical display with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a completely alien form of warfare. Your strategy, he said slowly, it's not designed to maximize military advantage. No, Chin agreed. It's designed to minimize suffering. Every target we've hit has been chosen to disable your ability to resist while causing the least possible harm to civilian populations. Every operation has been planned to achieve our objectives with minimal loss of life. Even Zephyrian lives, I said, beginning to understand. Especially Zephyrian lives, Chun confirmed. You're not our enemies because of what species you are. You're our enemies because of what you chose to do. When you stop choosing to harm others, you'll stop being our enemies. A new soldier entered the chamber and approached Chun. He whispered something in her ear that I couldn't hear, then stepped back to attention. The final phase is beginning, Chun announced. Your remaining fleet commanders have been contacted and offered terms for surrender. Those who accept will be treated with full military honors. Those who refuse will be destroyed. And us? Thane asked, gesturing to the council members. You'll be transported to a secure facility where you'll be held pending trial, Chun said. The trials will be fair and open, conducted according to galactic law. You'll have access to legal representation and the right to present your defense. You're treating us better than we treated our prisoners, I observed. Yes, Chun said. That's rather the point. As if summoned by her words, more human soldiers entered the chamber. But these ones weren't carrying weapons. Instead, they carried what appeared to be medical equipment. Standard procedure, Chun explained, seeing our confused expressions. Medical examinations to ensure you're in good health, psychological evaluations to determine your fitness for trial, and basic care for any injuries or conditions you might have. The contrast was stunning. Hours ago, we had been the rulers of a galactic empire. Now we were prisoners of war. But instead of the brutal treatment we had always given our own captives, we were being handled with professional courtesy and genuine concern for our well-being. I don't understand, Counselor Rax said as a human medic began scanning her crystalline form with gentle, careful movements. Why are you being kind to us? The medic looked up from her scanner. Because kindness is what separates civilization from barbarism, she said simply. If we treated you the way you treated others, we'd be no better than you were. Chin watched the medical team work with obvious pride. Humans learned a long time ago that how you treat your enemies says more about who you are than how you treat your friends. We choose to be better than our enemies, not to become like them. As the medics finished their examinations and began preparing us for transport, I found myself thinking about everything I had witnessed. The careful planning, the patient preparation, the massive coordination of resources across multiple species, and decades of time. The scope of this operation, I said to Chun, the resources required, the coordination needed. Your entire civilization must have been focused on this for generations. Not our entire civilization, Chun corrected, but a significant portion, yes. The United Earth Federation dedicated approximately 15% of our total industrial capacity to preparing for this operation. 15% of your entire civilization's output for 70 years to help people you had never met. To stop injustice, Chun corrected gently. The people we were helping were just one part of it. As the soldiers prepared to escort us from the chamber, I looked back at the tactical display one final time. The red markers representing human and allied forces now covered virtually our entire empire. In less than 6 hours, a civilization that had dominated this sector for 3,000 years had been completely dismantled. What will you call this operation in your history books? I asked Chun. She paused at the chamber door, considering the question. We won't, she said finally. This won't be remembered as a glorious victory or a great conquest. It will be recorded as a necessary task that had to be completed. Nothing more. No celebración. No monuments to your triumph. Chen's expression grew somber. There's nothing to celebrate about war, she said. Even when it's necessary, even when it's right, war always represents a failure of civilization. We'll remember the victims, not the victory. As we were led from the chamber, I caught one last glimpse of the city below. Human ships filled the sky, but instead of bombardment or destruction, they were deploying aid supplies and medical teams. Even in conquest, even in the complete destruction of our empire, the humans remained focused on preserving life and minimizing suffering. For the first time since the revelation began, I felt something other than fear or anger. I felt a strange sense of relief. For 3,000 years, the Zephyrian Empire had been built on the idea that might made right, that the strong had the natural right to dominate the weak. We had convinced ourselves that this was the natural order of the universe. But watching the humans work, seeing how they conducted their victory with such careful attention to justice and mercy, I began to understand that there was another way. A better way. Perhaps, I thought as we were led to the transport ships, this wasn't really an ending at all. Perhaps it was a beginning. The detention facility the humans built for us was unlike any prison I had ever imagined. Instead of the dark cells and brutal conditions we had always provided for our captives, they housed us in comfortable quarters with real furniture, proper lighting, and access to recreational activities. Each room had its own bathroom, a desk for writing, and even a small garden area where we could grow plants if we chose to. I spent the first week convinced it was some kind of psychological torture, that they were being kind to us only to make the inevitable brutality more devastating. But as the days passed and the gentle treatment continued, I began to understand that this wasn't a trick. This was simply how humans treated prisoners. My cell neighbor was Counselor Vex, and through the communication panels that connected our quarters, we spent long hours trying to understand what was happening to our empire. The human guards were surprisingly willing to answer our questions and provide us with news from the outside. The liberation of Kilara Prime is complete, Guard Sergeant Torres told us during one of his regular visits. The crystal farms have been converted back to artistic communities. The Kilarans are already producing their first free artwork in 70 years. What about the Thoraxians? I asked. Their moon colonies were our primary source of rare metals. They're back in control of their territories, Torres replied. Don't worry, though. They've agreed to continue mining operations under fair trade agreements. Turns out people work much harder when they're being paid for their labor instead of enslaved for it. The casual way he discussed the dismantling of our economic system was almost more shocking than the military defeat had been. These humans weren't just defeating our empire. They were systematically replacing it with something entirely different. What about our people? Vex asked. The Zephyrians who were living on the conquered worlds? Most of them are staying put, Torres said. We're not forcing anyone to relocate. The new governments are being required to establish equal rights for all species, including Zephyrians. Amazing how well different species can get along when no one's being oppressed. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the human psychologist assigned to evaluate us, visited me 3 times a week. Unlike the interrogators I had expected, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding how our society had developed and why we had chosen the path of conquest. It's fascinating from an anthropological perspective, she told me during one of our sessions. The Zephyrian capacity for psychic connection should have made you more empathetic, not less. Most telepathic species develop strong cooperative instincts because they can literally feel each other's emotions. Our psychic abilities were limited to our own species, I explained. We could communicate with other Zephyrians, but we felt nothing from alien minds. It made it easier to see them as less than ourselves. Ah, Dr. Martinez said, making notes on her tablet. So your telepathy actually created a stronger in-group slash out-group distinction. Interesting. Humans developed empathy across species lines because we had to learn to communicate through observation and interpretation. We got good at reading emotions in beings that didn't think like us. These conversations became the highlight of my detention. Dr. Martinez never judged or condemned our past actions, but she helped me understand how our society had gone wrong and how it might be fixed. The thing about empires, she told me one day, is that they always convince themselves they're doing good. Rome brought law and order. Britain brought civilization and progress. The Zephyrians brought unity and peace. But empire is still empire, no matter how you dress it up. Then, what's the alternative? I asked. How do you maintain order across multiple star systems without central authority? You don't maintain order, she said. You maintain justice. Order can be imposed from above, but justice has to come from within. That's why democratic governments work better in the long run, even though they're messy, and less efficient. 3 months into my detention, I received an unexpected visitor. Ambassador Chen entered my quarters wearing civilian clothes instead of her diplomatic uniform, looking somehow both younger and older than she had during the conquest. I wanted to check on your progress, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Dr. Martinez says you've been very cooperative with the evaluation process. What choice do I have? I asked, though without the bitterness that question would have carried a few months earlier. More than you think, Chen replied. That's actually why I'm here. We need to discuss your future. She activated a holographic display that showed a map of what had once been the Zephyrian Empire. But instead of the familiar imperial territories, it now showed dozens of independent systems, each marked with the symbols of their native species. The transition is going better than we expected, Chen explained. Most species have successfully established stable governments. Trade relationships are forming naturally between neighboring systems. The economic disruption has been minimal. And the Zephyrian worlds? That's more complicated, Chen admitted. Your people are struggling with the concept of democracy. 3,000 years of imperial rule didn't exactly prepare them for self-governance. They keep asking us to tell them what to do. I understood the problem immediately. Zephyrians had never had to make collective decisions without a psychic consensus. Our entire political system had been based on the assumption that our telepathic leaders could determine the will of the people directly. They need leaders who can function without psychic abilities, I said. Exactly, Chen confirmed. Which brings me to the reason for my visit. The transition government on Zephyria Prime has requested that certain former council members be released to help establish new political systems. You want us to go back and help create the democracy that will replace our empire. If you're willing, Chen said. Obviously, this would be contingent on your acceptance of certain conditions. You would be monitored by human advisors. You would have no military authority, and you would be required to undergo extensive retraining on democratic principles and human rights law. The irony wasn't lost on me. The humans were asking their former enemies to help build the very system that would ensure we could never again become a threat to galactic peace. Why? I asked. Why trust us with this responsibility? Chen's smile was sad but genuine. Because someone has to teach your people how to be free. And who better than former leaders who understand both the failures of the old system and the necessity of a new one? I spent 3 days considering the offer. During that time, I spoke with Dr. Martinez, with Guard Sergeant Torres, and even with some of the human administrators who were overseeing the transition process. Each conversation helped me understand more about what humans were trying to accomplish. They're not trying to punish us, I told Vex through our communication panel. They're trying to prevent this from happening again. You going to accept their offer? Vex observed. Yes, I said. I am. The retraining process took 6 months and was unlike any education I had ever received. Instead of being taught what to think, I was taught how to think. Human instructors showed me the philosophical foundations of democratic government, the practical mechanics of representative systems, and the historical examples of how societies had transitioned from authoritarian rule to freedom. Professor James Wright, a human political scientist, became my primary instructor. He had spent his entire career studying the collapse and reconstruction of authoritarian governments, and his insights were both humbling and inspiring. The challenge isn't creating democratic institutions, he told me. The challenge is creating a democratic culture. Laws and constitutions are just paper unless the people believe in the principles behind them. How do you make people believe in something they've never experienced? I asked. You show them, Wright said simply. You demonstrate that democracy works. You prove that people are happier and more prosperous when they're free. You let them see the results. The humans had established demonstration communities on several worlds, places where former subjects of the Empire could experience democratic governance firsthand. I visited one of these communities on Thorax 7, where humans, Thoraxians, Keelerans, and even Zephyrians were working together to build a new society. What I saw there changed my understanding of what civilization could be. Instead of the rigid hierarchies and forced obedience of the Empire, I witnessed voluntary cooperation between equals. People disagreed, argued, and debated, but they did so with mutual respect and shared commitment to finding solutions that worked for everyone. Mayor Elena Rodriguez, a human administrator, showed me around the community with obvious pride. It's not perfect, she admitted. We have problems, conflicts, disagreements. But we solve them together through discussion and compromise, not through force. It seems chaotic compared to imperial order, I observed. It is chaotic, she agreed. Democracy is messy and inefficient and frustrating. But it's also the only system that treats every person as a thinking being worthy of respect. I met former slaves who had become business owners, former prisoners who had been elected to local councils, former enemies who had become friends and partners. The transformation was so complete that it was hard to believe these worlds had once been part of our empire. When I returned to Zephyria, Prime 8 months after the conquest, I barely recognized my homeworld. The massive monuments to imperial glory had been replaced with parks and community centers. The government buildings that had once housed our authoritarian bureaucracy were being converted into schools and hospitals. But the most dramatic change was in the people themselves. Without the constant psychic reinforcement of imperial ideology, Zephyrians were beginning to think as individuals for the first time in their history. It was disturbing and wonderful to witness. My first public appearance was at a town hall meeting in what had once been the capital's main square. Thousands of Zephyrians had gathered to hear about the new government that was being formed, and many of them recognized me as a former council member. The reaction was mixed. Some shouted accusations and demanded to know why I deserved to participate in building the new system. Others seemed confused and lost, asking when the council would return to provide guidance and direction. There will be no council, I told them, my voice amplified by the same speakers that had once carried imperial decrees. There will be no supreme authority telling you what to think or how to live. From now on, you'll make those decisions for yourselves. The crowd fell silent, processing this information. Finally, an elderly Zephyrian in the front row raised one of his arms. But how will we know what the right decisions are? He asked. You'll figure it out together, I replied. You'll discuss the issues, consider different options, and vote on what you think is best. Sometimes you'll be wrong, and you'll have to try again. But the decisions will be yours to make. What if we make mistakes? Another voice called out. Then you'll make mistakes, I said. But they'll be your mistakes, made by free beings choosing their own path, not mistakes forced on you by rulers who claim to know better. Human advisor Captain Lisa Chun, no relation to Ambassador Chun, stood beside me throughout the meeting, ready to intervene if needed. But she remained silent, letting me handle the questions and concerns in my own way. After the meeting, she walked with me through the transformed streets of our capital. That was well done, she said. You're beginning to understand what this is really about. Freedom is terrifying, I observed. For species that have never had it, the responsibility can be overwhelming. That's why the transition has to be gradual, Captain Shin explained. We're not going to abandon your people to figure everything out overnight. Human advisors will remain for as long as necessary, helping and guiding, but not controlling. And when we no longer need your guidance, then you'll be truly free, she said, and we'll become your neighbors instead of your overseers. The first democratic election on Zephyria Prime was held 1 year after the conquest. The campaign period was chaotic, with dozens of political parties forming around different ideas about how the new government should work. Former Imperials, Reform Moderates, and Radical Democrats all competed for votes in a process that would have been unthinkable under the old system. I ran for the newly created position of Prime Minister, not because I expected to win, but because I wanted to participate in the process and show other former Imperials that change was possible. My campaign focused on reconciliation and rebuilding. I spoke openly about the crimes of the Empire and the necessity of making amends to the species we had wronged. I argued that Zephyria's future lay in cooperation with our former subjects, not in any attempt to recreate our lost power. The humans remained scrupulously neutral during the campaign, providing security and logistical support, but never endorsing any candidates or parties. Ambassador Chun attended several campaign events, but only as an observer. Aren't you worried we might elect someone who wants to restore the Empire? I asked her after one particularly heated debate. If that's what your people choose, then that's what they choose, she replied. Democracy means accepting that people have the right to make decisions you disagree with. Even if those decisions lead to war, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Chun said simply. But I don't think it will. I have more faith in your people than you do. She was right. When the votes were counted, the moderate Democratic parties had won a clear majority. The pro-imperial candidates received less than 20% of the vote, and even they were campaigning on platforms of reformed authoritarianism rather than a return to the old system. I didn't win the prime minister position, losing to Dr. Kalavex Prime, a Zephyrian scientist who had spent the last year studying human democratic theory. But I was elected to the new parliament, where I would have the opportunity to help write the laws that would govern our new society. The night after the election, I stood on the same balcony where I had first met Ambassador Chin over a year ago. The city below was celebrating, with Zephyrians of all ages participating in the festival that marked the birth of their democracy. Captain Chun found me there, watching the celebrations with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Having second thoughts? She asked. Many of them, I admitted. Democracy is much harder than empire. There are no simple solutions, no final answers. Just endless questions and the responsibility to keep searching for better ways. Welcome to civilization, she said with a smile. It's not easy, but it's worth it. As we watched the crowds below, I thought about everything that had changed since that first morning when crude human ships had descended through our atmosphere. An empire had fallen, but something better was being built in its place. Not just on Zephyria Prime, but throughout the galaxy, as dozens of species learn to live as equals instead of masters and slaves. What happens now? I asked. When your people are satisfied that we can govern ourselves, when the transition is complete, then we go home, Captain Chin said. And we wait. Wait for what? For the next empire that needs to be stopped, she said quietly. For the next species that cries out for liberation. For the next time the galaxy needs someone to stand up and say that freedom matters more than power. I understood then what humans truly were. They weren't conquerors or empire builders. They were liberators, carrying the torch of freedom to dark corners of the galaxy, willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety to ensure that others could choose their own destinies. Thank you, I said simply. Thank your own people, Captain Chin replied. They're the ones doing the hard work now. They're the ones who chose to be free. The celebration continued into the night, the sound of joy and hope echoing through streets that had once known only fear and obedience. And somewhere in that sound, I heard the beginning of something new. The age of empire was ending. The age of freedom had begun. 5 years had passed since the fall of the Zephyrian Empire, and I was beginning to understand what humans meant when they talked about building something better. The Zephyrian Democratic Republic was still young and fragile, but it was growing stronger with each passing month. As a member of parliament, I had the privilege of seeing democracy in action from the inside. It was messier than I had ever imagined, full of arguments and compromises and difficult decisions that satisfied no one completely. But it was also more effective than the old imperial system had ever been. The infrastructure bill passed by a margin of 3 votes, announced Speaker Thaxminer during our morning session. Construction will begin on the new transportation network linking all our colony worlds. I remembered how such projects had been handled under the Empire. A decree would be issued, resources would be seized from conquered worlds, and the work would be done by slave labor. Now, every detail had been debated, every cost carefully considered, every affected community consulted. It had taken 6 months instead of 6 days, but the final project was better designed and had the full support of the people who would pay for it. After the session, I walked through the streets of New Zephyria, our rebuilt capital city. Human advisors were still present, but their role had changed dramatically over the years. Instead of overseers, they had become consultants and friends. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, Dr. Martinez, had been promoted to military service as the transition continued, met me at our usual cafe for our weekly discussion about the ongoing changes in our society. "How are the reparation payments progressing?" she asked, reviewing a tablet full of economic data. "Ahead of schedule," I reported with some pride. "The Keeler Crystal Trade Agreement is generating more revenue than we projected, and the Thoraxian mining partnerships are exceeding production targets. Voluntary cooperation is more efficient than forced labor," Martinez observed. Who would have thought? The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Our economy was stronger now than it had been under the Empire, despite the fact that we were paying massive reparations to the species we had formerly enslaved. It turned out that willing partners were more productive than unwilling subjects. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Martinez said, her expression growing serious. "We've received some disturbing intelligence from the Outer Rim." She activated her tablet's holographic display, showing a star map of the region beyond our former empire's borders. Several systems were marked in red. "The Krillian hegemony has been expanding aggressively over the past 2 years," she explained. "They've conquered 4 independent worlds and enslaved the populations. Their military technology appears to be advancing rapidly." My blood ran cold. The Krillians were an insectoid species known for their rigid caste system and their belief that other species existed only to serve their queen. They had been a minor power during the height of our empire, too small and distant to be worth conquering. "How many systems do they control now?" I asked. 17, and growing," Martinez replied. "Intelligence suggests they're planning to move into former Zephyrian territory within the next year." The implications were staggering. We had spent 5 years building democratic governments and peaceful societies. We had disbanded most of our military forces and converted weapons factories into civilian industries. If the Krillians attacked now, we would be almost defenseless. "What does Earth Command recommend?" I asked. Martinez's smile was grim. "That's the interesting part. Earth Command isn't making any recommendations. They're leaving this decision entirely up to the newly independent governments." "You're testing us," I realized. "We're letting you be free," she corrected. "Real freedom means having the right to make your own decisions about war and peace. If we told you what to do, even to protect you, we'd be just another empire." That afternoon, I called an emergency session of Parliament. The chamber was packed as I presented the intelligence about the Krillian threat to my fellow legislators. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some representatives demanded that we immediately begin rearming and rebuilding our military forces. Others argued that we should seek protection from Earth Command rather than risk a war we might not be able to win. We cannot simply rely on human protection forever, declared Representative Kextau, a former military officer who had embraced democratic principles. If we do not learn to defend ourselves, we will never truly be free. But if we rebuild our military to imperial levels, how do we prevent ourselves from becoming what we once were? Countered Representative Nala Prime, a pacifist who had been elected from one of our agricultural colonies. The debate continued for hours, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of freedom, the responsibility of democratic governments, and the price of security. I listened to all sides before finally speaking. The Krillians represent everything we used to be, I said. They believe in conquest, in enslaving other species, in the right of the strong to dominate the weak. If we do nothing, they will destroy everything we've built here. So you support rearmament? Asked Representative Vex Secondary. I support freedom, I replied. And sometimes freedom requires the willingness to fight for it. The Parliament voted to begin a modest rearmament program, focusing on defensive capabilities rather than offensive weapons. But, more importantly, we voted to reach out to the other newly independent governments that had once been part of our empire. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every single former imperial world agreed to contribute to a joint defense force. The Keelerans offered their crystal technology for shields and energy systems. The Thoraxians provided their expertise with heavy weapons and armor. The Forlac contributed their knowledge of biowarfare and medical support. But it was the humans who provided the most crucial element: leadership and coordination. Admiral Rebecca Chun, Ambassador Chen's daughter, who had followed her mother into diplomatic and military service, arrived on Zephyria Prime 3 months after the parliamentary vote. She was young for such a high position, but her credentials were impeccable. I want to be clear about Earth Command's position, she told the Joint Defense Council during our first meeting. We will provide training, equipment, and tactical support, but this will be your fight to plan and execute. We're not here to save you. We're here to help you save yourselves. The difference was subtle, but crucial. Instead of taking control of the situation, the humans were empowering us to handle it ourselves. They would be advisors and partners, not commanders and protectors. Training began immediately. Veterans from a dozen different species worked together to develop new tactics that combined their various strengths and abilities. Human instructors taught us about modern warfare, but they also insisted that we develop our own solutions to strategic problems. Captain Lisa Martinez, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's sister, apparently military service ran in the family, was assigned as my personal liaison. She had studied Zephyrian history and culture extensively and understood both our capabilities and our psychological barriers. Your people are struggling with the concept of limited warfare, she observed after watching one of our strategic planning sessions. You're thinking in terms of total conquest or total defeat. That's how wars were fought under the Empire, I explained. Victory meant the complete subjugation of the enemy. But you're not an empire anymore, Martinez pointed out. Your goal isn't to conquer the Krillians. It's to stop them from conquering you and your neighbors. That requires a completely different approach. She was right, of course. We had to learn to think defensively, to focus on protection rather than domination. It was harder than it sounded for a species that had spent 3 millennia as conquerors. The first Krillian attack came 6 months later, targeting the Forlax system on the edge of our defensive perimeter. Their fleet was massive, easily 3 times the size of our hastily assembled defense force. By all traditional military logic, we should have been crushed. But we weren't fighting a traditional military campaign. The Forlac had evacuated their non-combatants to hidden colonies in the asteroid belt, leaving behind a network of automated defense platforms and sensor stations. When the Krillian fleet arrived, they found what appeared to be a lightly defended system ripe for conquest. They were wrong. The battle lasted for 18 hours, and I watched it unfold from the Joint Command Center on Zephyria Prime. Admiral Chun stood beside me, observing, but not interfering as our newly trained commanders coordinated the defense. Krillian heavy cruisers are moving to engage the orbital platforms, reported Commander Vextal, a former Imperial officer who had proven remarkably adaptable to defensive tactics. Let them come, replied General Nalakex, the Forlac commander overseeing the system's defense. Phase 2 activation on my mark. What happened next was something the Krillians had never encountered before. Instead of trying to match their firepower directly, our forces used mobility and coordination to turn the enemy's strength against them. Thoraxian fighter squadrons, supported by Keeler and shield generators, struck at the Krillian flanks while the main fleet was engaged with our fixed defenses. Forlac bio ships, nearly invisible to conventional sensors, infiltrated the enemy formation and disabled key command vessels from within. But the most devastating part of our strategy was something the humans had taught us. We made the Krillians fight for every meter of space. Instead of one decisive battle, they faced dozens of smaller engagements, each one costing them ships and soldiers they couldn't afford to lose. They're retreating, announced Commander Vextal, his voice filled with amazement. The entire Krillian fleet is withdrawing from the system. The command center erupted in celebration, but Admiral Chun remained focused on the tactical display. This was just their first probe, she warned. They'll be back with a larger force and better intelligence about your capabilities. She was right. Over the next year, the Krillians launched 7 more attacks against different systems in our alliance. Each time, they came with more ships and improved tactics. Each time, they were repelled by coordinated defensive actions that cost them far more than they could inflict on us. But the real victory wasn't military. It was political and social. The alliance is working, I told Lieutenant Colonel Martinez during one of our regular meetings. Species that were once enemies are fighting side by side to protect each other's freedom. More than that, she replied, showing me casualty reports from the latest battle. They're dying for each other. Zephyrian pilots gave their lives to protect Keeleran transports. Thoraxian soldiers held their positions to cover Forlac evacuations. That's not just alliance. That's brotherhood. The transformation was remarkable to witness. 5 years earlier, these species had been subjects of our empire, forced to work together through fear and oppression. Now, they were choosing to work together through shared values and mutual respect. The final confrontation came in the 8th year after the Empire's fall. The Krillian Queen herself arrived with the largest fleet ever assembled in this sector of the galaxy, determined to crush our alliance once and for all. 2,000 ships reported our long-range sensors, including their new Dreadnought-class vessels. Our combined fleet numbered barely 600 vessels, a mixture of converted civilian ships and purpose-built defensive platforms. By every measure of conventional military power, we were hopelessly outmatched. Recommendations? Asked Admiral Chun, looking around the command center at the assembled representatives of our alliance. We fight, said General Nalakex without hesitation. We fight together, added Commander Vextal. We fight for freedom, I concluded. The battle that followed lasted 3 days and became known as the Battle of Liberation Point, fought in the asteroid field that marked the boundary between our territory and theirs. It was the largest space battle in galactic history, and it would determine whether democracy or tyranny would dominate this sector for the next 1,000 years. I won't pretend it was easy or that victory was certain. We lost good ships and brave people. Species that had been rebuilding their civilizations for less than a decade sacrificed everything to hold the line against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. But we had advantages the Krillians couldn't understand or counter. We had unity born of choice rather than fear. We had technology developed through cooperation rather than conquest. And we had something they lacked entirely, the knowledge that we were fighting for something worth dying for. When the Krillian Queen's flagship finally exploded in a brilliant flash of light, taking their command structure and their dreams of conquest with it, the surviving enemy ships scattered like leaves in a storm. The war was over. Admiral Chun found me on the observation deck after the battle, staring out at the debris field that had once been the greatest threat our young democracy had ever faced. Your people did well, she said simply. All of our people, I corrected. This victory belongs to every species that chose freedom over slavery. What will you do now, she asked. The threat is ended. You could disband your alliance, return to your individual worlds. I thought about the question for a long moment, watching as rescue ships from a dozen different species worked together to search for survivors among the wreckage. No, I said finally. We've learned something important these past few years. Freedom is not something you achieve once and then forget about. It's something you have to protect every day from enemies both foreign and domestic. So you'll maintain the alliance? We'll expand it, I said. We'll reach out to other species, other worlds that want to live free. We'll build something bigger and stronger than any empire ever was. Admiral Chin smiled, and I saw something in her expression that I had rarely seen from humans. Genuine pride. Now you understand, she said. This is what we've been waiting for. Not for you to become like us, but for you to become who you were meant to be. As I watched the rescue operations continue, ships from former enemies working side by side to save lives regardless of species or origin, I finally understood what humans had really given us. They hadn't given us freedom. They had given us the opportunity to choose freedom for ourselves. And we had chosen well. 25 years had passed since the fall of the Zephyrian Empire, and I was no longer the young counselor who had watched human ships descend from the sky with casual arrogance. My once vibrant skin had faded to the pale silver of advanced age, and my movements had slowed with the weight of decades. But my mind remained sharp, and my purpose had never been clearer. I stood in the central chamber of Unity Station, the massive space facility that served as headquarters for what we now call the Galactic Freedom Alliance. Through the transparent aluminum walls, I could see ships from 47 different species docked at the station's ports. Each vessel represented a world that had chosen liberty over tyranny, democracy over authoritarianism. The morning briefing is about to begin, Elder Zex Prime, said my aide, a young Keeleran named Lyra, whose crystalline features sparkled with intelligent curiosity. She was part of the first generation born free, and sometimes I envied her inability to truly comprehend what slavery had been like. Thank you, Lyra, I replied, gathering the reports I had been reviewing. Please make sure that Admiral Martinez has the latest intelligence from the Meridian sector. Admiral Elena Martinez was the daughter of Captain Lisa Martinez, carrying on the family tradition of service to freedom. The humans had a saying about the apple not falling far from the tree, and it seemed particularly appropriate for the Martinez family. The briefing chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of worlds, all of them working together to address the latest challenges facing free civilizations. Today's primary concern was the hegemony of Eternal Order, a coalition of authoritarian species that had risen in the galaxy's outer rim. The hegemony now controls over 300 star systems, reported Intelligence Director Kalavorthsen, a Thoraxian whose species had become renowned for their analytical abilities. Their expansion rate has accelerated significantly over the past 5 years. I studied the holographic display showing the hegemony's territory. It was vast, stretching across nearly a quarter of the galaxy's outer edge. More troubling was the fact that it seemed to be expanding in a deliberate pattern, surrounding and isolating democratic worlds before absorbing them. What's their ideology? Asked Representative Nalikex, who had transitioned from military service to diplomatic work after the Krillian War. Standard authoritarian philosophy with some concerning modifications, replied Dr. Saracha Martinez. The humans had an interesting naming convention that honored multiple family lines. They preached the necessity of absolute order, the inherent chaos of democratic systems, and the need for what they call guided evolution of inferior species. The last part sent chills through my aged bones. Guided evolution was a euphemism I had heard before in the early days of the Zephyrian Empire. It meant slavery with a philosophical justification. Are they aware of our alliance? I asked. Absolutely, Admiral Martinez replied. They refer to us as the Democratic Contagion in their official communications. They see our very existence as a threat to their vision of galactic order. The irony was not lost on me. 25 years ago, we had been the authoritarian empire threatening democracy. Now we were the Democratic Alliance threatened by authoritarianism. The cycle continued, but our position in it had changed completely. "What do our human advisors recommend?" asked General Vextal, who had become one of our most respected military strategists. Admiral Martinez paused before answering, her expression thoughtful. "Earth Command has been very clear about this. Humanity will not lead another liberation campaign. If the galaxy wants to remain free, it has to be willing to fight for freedom itself." The statement hit the chamber like a physical blow. For 25 years, we had grown accustomed to human guidance and support. The idea of facing a major threat without their direct involvement was terrifying. "Are they abandoning us?" asked Representative Thorex, a normally calm Forlac whose bioluminescent skin was flickering with distress. "Not abandoning," Admiral Martinez clarified. "But humanity learned something from the last war. When they liberated us from the Zephyrian Empire, they created a dependency. You look to them for leadership, for solutions, for protection. That's not freedom. That's just a more benevolent form of subjugation." I understood the human position intellectually, but emotionally it felt like betrayal. We had grown comfortable with the idea that humanity would always be there to defend freedom when tyranny arose. "So what are they offering?" I asked. "Training, equipment, intelligence, diplomatic support," Martinez replied. "Everything except leadership. If the galaxy wants to stop the hegemony, it has to do so through its own choices and its own efforts." The weeks that followed were among the most challenging in the Alliance's history. We had to overcome not just the external threat of the hegemony, but our own internal doubts about our ability to lead a galactic resistance movement. The debates were intense and sometimes bitter. Some species wanted to seek accommodation with the hegemony, hoping that submission might spare them the worst excesses of authoritarian rule. Others advocated for immediate military action, arguing that waiting would only make the enemy stronger. I found myself in the unusual position of being a voice for aggressive action. My personal history as a former imperial leader gave me unique credibility when I spoke about the nature of authoritarian expansion. The hegemony will not stop with voluntary submission, I told the Alliance Council during one particularly heated session. Authoritarian regimes exist through conquest and domination. They cannot coexist with free societies because our very existence disproves their fundamental assumptions about the necessity of absolute control. "You're asking us to start a galactic war based on speculation," challenged Representative Morikex, a pacifist from one of the Rim worlds. "I'm asking you to start a galactic war based on history," I replied. "I lived through the expansion of one empire. I know how these things work. The hegemony will keep growing until someone stops them, and they're easier to stop now than they will be when they control half the galaxy." The decision, when it finally came, was not the unanimous vote I had hoped for. The Alliance chose to resist the hegemony by a margin of just 3 votes, and even then, several member worlds opted out of military participation. But it was enough. Preparations began immediately for what we called the Freedom Campaign. Unlike the desperate defensive actions of the Krillian War, this would be an offensive operation designed to liberate worlds already under hegemony control and prevent further expansion. The scale was staggering. We assembled a fleet of over 5,000 ships representing 41 different species. The logistics alone required innovations in interstellar cooperation that had never been attempted before. I was selected to serve as the campaign's civilian oversight coordinator, working with Admiral Chamartinez, Admiral Elena Martinez's daughter, continuing the family tradition.